U.S. Defense to its workforce, nuclear war can be won. It is written by nuclear arms experts for the approximately 30,000 members of the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command and the 700,000 total force airmen who engage in the profession of arms. All of the authors have direct or indirect connections with the nuclear weapons complex or associated think tanks, and several of the authors have held senior positions with the Air Force Global Strike Command, U.S. Strategic Command, and other national security agencies in the U.S. government. The guide's messaging is comprehensive, but dangerously skewed. The guide centers around a new reality, the aggressive development of nuclear arms by Russia and China that is intensifying a new Cold War. Nuclear arms treaties, an important tool for limiting arms races, are brushed aside as functionally pointless since, according to the guide, Russia will cheat, and China won't come to the bargaining table. In one passage, the guide claims it is unlikely that these countries would be foolish enough to engage in a strategic arms race with the United States, and, if they do, they will lose. Yet much of the remainder of the document analyzes all the ways in which China and Russia are advancing their capabilities beyond U.S. capabilities. These threatening developments are then used to justify the rapid and expensive modernization of the U.S. nuclear weapon complex, while many historic nuclear arms agreements wither away, including the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and the Iran nuclear deal. Misrepresentation: a nuclear war can be fought and won. That the U.S. military considers scenarios under which nuclear deterrence fails is unsurprising. But in the event of limited nuclear war, the United States has plans in place to beat its adversaries. According to the guide, U.S. strategic nuclear forces might be expected to perform the following functions: endurance throughout the various phases of a protracted, and presumably limited, nuclear war, or establish escalation dominance and nuclear strategic superiority over any prospective opponent. The guide does not acknowledge that, throughout the Cold War, the U.S. defense establishment itself regarded counterforce, that is, attacks on Russia's nuclear forces, and limited escalation as implausible. Only after the Cold War did the defense establishments scrap their massive, all-out attack plan in favor of counterforce, aiming nuclear weapons primarily at military targets to minimize the number of nuclear weapons that the adversary could launch. That said, many military targets are in densely populated cities. Counterforce is ostensibly for minimizing U.S. casualties, but it may also promote paranoia about a disarming U.S. first strike. Given these defense establishment beliefs, it is encouraging that the current U.S. administration appears unwilling to fight a war in Ukraine that could possibly escalate into nuclear conflict. Omission: the reality of nuclear war. In this more than 400-page guide, only 3 pages are devoted to a rather anodyne description of the devastating harms of nuclear weapons. It notes that thermal radiation can cause skin burns and fires to targets at great distances, and the human body is also sensitive to the duration of the blast wave. It adds that the substances that remain following a nuclear explosion can be radioactive and harmful. Misrepresentation: nuclear weapons keep the peace. The guide credits nuclear weapons and U.S. nuclear superiority with the era of long peace, the absence of major wars between superpowers since 1945. As such, it posits that, the more U.S. nuclear weapons, the better. Other potential contributors to the long peace, the rise of democracies, global commerce, international organizations, international law, and the hardening of national boundaries, are briefly mentioned in the guide, but only in the service of downplaying their effects. Despite these other contributors, the guide asserts that nuclear disarmament is implausible, if not impossible, in any anticipated time frame, whatever may be the weaknesses of nuclear deterrence. The guide portrays the ever-present risk of nuclear annihilation as a worthy trade for the possibility of fewer interstate conflicts. Misrepresentation: nuclear weapon mistakes and accidents never happen. Indeed, the guide does not mention the many well-documented false alarms and close calls of nuclear detonation from technical or human error that could have led to catastrophe. It does not acknowledge the dangers posed by the imperfect humans who control the nuclear weapons and infrastructure. It does not mention that Intercontinental Ballistic Missile (ICBM) crew members were caught cheating on exams or that the Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended an invasion of Cuba during the missile crisis. Nor is there mention of the harms caused by nuclear testing to many communities. The guide portrays the United States as if it is in perfect control of its nuclear weapons operations. Such a minor conventional attack would somehow involve tracking and eliminating all of the U.S. nuclear-armed submarines and confidently dropping enough conventional explosives, or nuclear weapons, to decimate critical nuclear command and control structures, both U.S. submarine bases, and all U.S. air bases where warheads are held, including overseas air bases that hold gravity bombs. Additionally, the adversary would have to be extraordinarily confident in the destruction of all U.S. submarines, since even one submarine, with about 100 warheads, possesses a retaliatory force capable of annihilating a nation. Lastly, this scenario assumes that NATO allies would not bother to use any of their several hundred nuclear warheads after an adversary destroys a significant portion of the U.S. homeland. The guide dismisses critiques of the ICBM force, including the accompanying launch on warning and use them or lose them postures that increase the danger of accidental nuclear war. Modern early warning systems, the guide argues, are redundant, more advanced, and more reliable than during the Cold War. This is true, but the guide also notes that early warning systems and satellites are likely to be targeted before a conventional or nuclear strike is launched. In fact, the guide makes clear that many U.S. and Russian early warning and satellite systems are old, vulnerable to cyber and anti-satellite attacks, and unable to track more advanced delivery systems such as hypersonic glide vehicles. A strike on early warning systems would reduce sensor capabilities and could itself be interpreted by U.S. service members as evidence of an incoming nuclear strike. Yet, some of the same authors argue that the nation's space and land-based early warning systems have a perfect track record and therefore the risk of accidental war is minimal.